You know the worship's good when I almost forgot that I had to come up here. I was like, oh yeah, I still have to do something, I guess. But I got really lost in it, so thank you, worship team. That was really good worship service. Good start. I'm flustered. All right. Our God is great, you know? It's good to be reminded of that from time to time. But He is. He's a great God. He's an all-good God. All good comes from Him. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. I'm going to get back on track. All right. Welcome back. Look at that. Good morning. Welcome back. All right. I'm in it. All right. So we're back in our Acts series. This week we got 2 chapters left. This is the second to the last chapter. I'm going to do a little bit of chapter 28 also, but this is chapter 27. Last week we saw Paul. He was on trial in front of a series of different men. This week we're going to see a different set of trials for Paul. All right? Paul's really having a rough go of it over the past few years, and he's got some tough days ahead of him as well. But remember, Paul has one goal in mind. All right? God has told him time and time again he has to get to Rome, so that's what he's going to do. He is getting to Rome. That's the only thing Paul wants to do at this point, complete the work that God has given to him. So we left off last week. Paul had given his testimony, but also just his account of what happened, his side of the case, to King Agrippa and Governor Festus. They both agreed that Paul had done nothing worthy of death or imprisonment, but because Paul had invoked his right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar, these guys' hands were they were tied. They're like, you got to go to Rome. As we're reading this week, we're going to read the journey from where Paul was to Rome, this ship voyage that he's going to take. And the first thing that's going to pop into your head is Paul's really just having a hard time. It just seems like one roadblock after another is preventing him from accomplishing this one goal that he has. But I don't want you to focus too much on that, right? We talk about that sort of thing a lot. We talk a lot about having roadblocks and how things are difficult. And, we're obviously going to talk about that today. But what I really want to make today about, because I think it's interesting, is I want you guys to keep an eye out for the effects that Paul has on the people around him during this journey, right? He's going to be going through this. These people, who some of them met Paul when he got on the boat, are affected by the decisions that Paul has made to get to this point. All right? We're going to call those like secondary effects, or we're going to call those residual effects or indirect effects. And I want to really start to keep an eye out for those sorts of things. I don't think we think enough about the indirect effects of our lives as Christians, right? We think a lot about the direct effects, right? I come here on Sunday mornings and I give a message. That is a direct effect of the calling in my life. But there's a lot of indirect things that happen too. And an example that I want to give is, I'm going to give an example. Brian and Matt, they get here early to start setting up sound stuff. That is a direct thing that they do. And the congregation feels that directly. Because they set up, we get to have worship and stuff like that. But sometimes, Brian will bring a couple of his kids with him in the morning as well, right? If they're ready, I don't know what the rules are, but if they're ready, they get in the truck and they get to come with Dad to church. What are some of the indirect things that Brian serving in the morning on Sundays has? They get to see Dad waking up early. They get to see Dad coming in and serving his community, having fellowship with friends, working hard for the Lord. That's something that he doesn't do it for that reason. He's not coming here so that his kids see that that's what you're supposed to do on Sunday mornings. But they get that indirect effect along with the direct effect of actually making sure that we have service on Sundays. So I want to keep an eye out for the indirect impacts that Paul has along the way. All right, and we're going to talk about it as we go through. But that's what I want you guys to look for. All right, so we're going to be in Acts 27, starting in verse 1. And I'll read. When the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on a ship whose home port was Adramyttium, I think that's right, Adramyttium, on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. So Paul and Aristarchus, we remember Aristarchus, he was in Ephesus for that first riot. We talked about that at the end of the third missionary trip. But then we're seeing these we and us passages again. So what does that tell us? That tells us that Luke is along for the ride with Paul and Aristarchus. So it says that they're placed in the custody of this guy, Julius, this Roman officer. Some of your translations might say that he's a centurion, right? A century is 100 men. He's the captain of 100 men. And it says they are part of the imperial regiment. Some of your translations might say the Augustan cohort. I don't know if anybody says that, the Augustan cohort. But basically what that means is you got to think of these guys as almost like Caesar's private guard, okay? So these guys are sent out. They go on special missions. They do the things that the emperor asks them to do. This is a special unit who reports directly to Caesar, all right? So this isn't like a standard run-of-the-mill Roman century. And we can already see some of the indirect impacts of Paul in these very first two verses, all right? The persecuting of Paul is affecting Luke and Aristarchus, right? I think it's fair to assume that if Paul wasn't being arrested and being sent to Rome, these gentlemen would probably not be getting on this boat. They wouldn't be going to Rome either. So in this case, this is an indirect impact that seems somewhat negative. Now, obviously, we know that God works all things together for good. We know that God has a purpose for them getting on this boat. But for them, right now, being friends with Paul doesn't really help their situation out very much, right? They are facing persecution because of that relationship. So back to this Roman centurion, he's going to feel some of these indirect effects of being in Paul's orbit also. He is only going to be with Paul for a short period of time, a couple of weeks during this process. But I think what you're going to see is that Paul leaves a lasting impact on him as well. So let's continue to read and look out for these indirect impacts. The next day, we docked at Sidon. Julius was very kind to Paul, and he let him go ashore and visit with friends so that they could provide for his needs. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the shore on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus, between the island and the mainland, keeping to the open sea. We passed along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, landing at Myra, in the province of Lycia. There, the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. It says that Julius was very kind to Paul. The Greek word there is philanthropos. It's where we get the word philanthropy. So he was being very generous with Paul. But I want to take a second to ask why. Why would this Roman official be very kind to Paul? You have to remember that the law in Rome at the time was that if a soldier was to lose a prisoner, they would have to stand in their place. They paid the punishment that the prisoner was going to pay. So why is this guy being so generous with Paul? Perhaps he's just a nice guy. That seems unlikely. I like to think that I'm a pretty nice guy. I'm not just letting prisoners hang out on the beach with their friends, especially if I'm going to pay the price if they decide to run away. So I don't know, maybe I'm not that nice a guy, but that seems unlikely. Some people think that maybe he had become a believer along the way, that Paul had preached the gospel to him, and he became a fellow believer. Maybe he was participating on the beach with them. That also seems unlikely to me. I think Luke is pretty diligent with his records. When Paul converts the governor of Cyprus, Luke makes a point to make sure that that gets mentioned. I think that if Paul had converted this man, Luke would have mentioned it, but some people think that. Maybe Paul is just so singularly focused on getting to Rome. He can't stop talking about it. Maybe the guy knows Paul's not going anywhere else. Maybe he just wants to get him off the boat for a while so he doesn't have to hear about how bad this guy wants to get to Rome. We don't really know for sure why this guy's being nice, but he's being nice. So they load back up, and this time they get on a new boat. This is where the story starts to get kind of interesting, okay? So we see that the winds and the seas are getting rough, and Julius finds them another ship from Alexandria. And these ships, this particular ship, but these ships are large grain ships. And what's really interesting about these ships is that they receive special treatment in Rome. Okay? The shipping lanes would close in the late fall and the winter because the seas were just too rough for traveling. All right? So Rome still needs grain, right? They still need to feed their people. So what Caesar would do is he would insure the boats to keep them running even though the shipping lanes were closed. So these boats, they would go out, and if they were to lose the boat or all of the cargo, Caesar would cover the cost. So I want you guys to have that's important mindset of the people of the boat that they're getting on. These people, they're going to get to Rome no matter what. They don't care how rough the seas are. They know that if they lose the boat, if they lose the cargo, Caesar's paying for it anyway. Their goal is to make money. Okay. So we know they're getting on a boat with some questionable intent. We've already started hearing about strong headwinds and stuff like that. They've had to switch boats to make sure that they're on a boat that can run through the winter if needed. We've got a little bit of foreshadowing going on here, right? You guys can see where this is going. Let's pick up in verse 7. So we had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Cnidus. The sea is silent. I looked it up. But the wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island, past the Cape of Salmon. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty, and we finally arrived at Fair Havens, a town near Lasea. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for the travel. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. The Greek does not say it was so late in the fall. It actually says, literally translated, because the fast was already gone by now. The fast was already gone by now. So the fast that they're talking about is Yom Kippur. That was just last week, if you guys are following the Jewish calendar. So this tells us that they're probably in like early to mid-October. So Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Men, he said, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on, shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and to the owner than Paul. And since Fair Haven was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, further up the coast of Crete. So the captain of the guard decides to listen to the captain of the boat, and we know what the captain of the boat's motivations are, all right? So what I want you to do is take a look at your maps. Their goal is to move along the coast from Fair Haven up to Phoenix. They're just going to skirt the side of the island there. Seems easy enough, right? And from there they would winter and wait for spring, wait for the weather to calm back down. Picking up in verse 13. So a light wind began blowing from the south. That would keep them up close to the island. And the sailors thought they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and they sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength called a nor'easter burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. They sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us. Then the sailors bound the ropes on the hull of the ship to strengthen it. Imagine being in a storm so bad that you're using ropes to try and hold it together while you're out at sea. They were afraid of being driven across the sandbars to Syrtis. Why am I struggling with this? Syrtis. It is Syrtis. I don't know why I'm struggling with that. Okay. Off the African coast, so that they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began to throw cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged on for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars. Remember, that's how they navigated, sun and the stars. So they couldn't tell where they were going. Until at last all hope was gone. No one had eaten for a long time, and finally, Paul called the crew together and said, Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. Got to get that I told you so in, right? Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me, and he said, "Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island." So this is where I want to go back and talk about those indirect effects. And as I said, I don't think this is something that we talk about enough. Really, when we talk about our relationship with God, it's almost always about how it affects us, right? Our relationship with God. What does it mean for me? How can God use my gifting to help others? And it can be very self-centric. But there is a theological concept that I want you guys to think about. Maybe you've heard it before if you haven't, but there is something called common grace. Who's heard that term, common grace? I've got a few people that have heard of it. If you haven't heard the term common grace, I'm sure you've at least heard of the concept, but here's the basic idea. If all good things come from God, and all humans, believers and non-believers alike, experience good things, at least occasionally, then God is blessing all people with his goodness and grace on some level. All right, here's an example. Beauty. You don't have to be a Christian to experience beauty, right? Christians and non-Christians alike can both appreciate the beauty of a sunset or a sunrise. We all have our breath taken away at the Grand Canyon. God blesses all people with the beauty of his creation. That is a blessing of common grace. Okay? Here's another example. Education. God has given us all the ability to learn and teach and understand things. Okay? He gives us all the ability to transfer information, to learn from each other. We've all had non-Christian teachers in school growing up and things like that. That's only possible because God has blessed all humans with the ability to learn and teach and understand. That is a common grace. The phones in our pockets, the microphone on my collar, these things could only be developed because God has gifted all humans with the ability to learn, teach, and think, right? That's common grace. Another form of common grace is when non-Christians reap the benefits of simply being in proximity to Christians to whom God is blessing, all right? And that's what's going on here. Paul is destined for Rome. That is God's plan for him. And because Paul is determined to complete the work that God has given him, he ended up on this ship during this storm. And because God chooses to save this ship for Paul's sake, he extends that grace to the passengers of the ship as well. What if Paul wouldn't have been on this ship? If Paul wouldn't have been on this ship, we don't know for sure what would have happened, but the angel said that God granted safety to those who are sailing. It implies that God would not have granted the safety if Paul wasn't there, and that ship might have been lost at sea. These sailors and other prisoners are benefiting from simply being in proximity to Paul while he's following God's will. They are experiencing that common grace. Think about the people you love most in your life. Your family, your friends, your coworkers. What quote-unquote shipwrecks could God be granting them safety from simply because you are on the same metaphorical ship? Just because you are there doing what God is calling you to do, people could be feeling God's grace in their lives. I don't know what each one of your Romes is. You know, that's Paul's mission to get to Rome. I don't know what your mission is. I don't know what work God has for you. But I do know that it is about much more than just you. All right? Paul isn't going to Rome for himself. He wasn't going to see the sights. He wasn't going to have tea with Caesar. All right? He was going to spread the gospel. And because he did that, because he carried the gospel to the ends of the earth, you and I, we're here in this room carrying around God's word with us. That is an indirect effect. That wasn't necessarily Paul's primary goal, but the result of that goal ended up with all of these other things. So what could God use our obedience to accomplish? Who in our lives could be the recipient of God's grace simply because we chose to stop living our lives selfishly for ourselves, but instead for him. You know, we talk about how this country is formed on Christian values, right? You guys have heard that this is a Judeo-Christian country. And that means that even the non-Christians in this country benefit from living in a country formed on Christian ideas. Everybody in this country, everybody in America benefits from the indirect effects of those early American Christians who were living out their faith. So when the storms are raging in your life, when it feels like you can barely keep the ship together, right? You're using ropes to hold the hull together. Consider the people who are on the boat with you. Because it's not just about you. Consider the other recipients. Consider the recipients of the cargo that you're carrying on that boat. What it could mean for someone else. What could God use those things for? And take those things in your mind and lean in, press on, continue the mission like Paul did. All right, let's keep going in verse 27. About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, as we were being driven across the sea of Adria, the sailors sensed land was near. So they dropped away to the line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A little later, they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid they would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. We've entered the praying phase of this trip. We're like, we're in trouble. We got to get out of here. Everybody believes in God when their life is on the line, right? Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboats as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You will die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. I think this is a really good picture of people still trying to do it their own way, right? They prayed, they wanted God's help, but they weren't willing to follow God's plan quite yet, right? The way I imagine this is like, imagine me saying to God, you know, you provided me this boat, you promised I would survive this trip, I know we got rough seas ahead, I still want to try and do it my way. I'm going to hop in this little boat. I don't need the boat that you provided me. I'm going to take my boat out and see how it works out. That's what these guys were doing. But Paul knows better. He tells them, we've got to stick with God's plan. We don't want to be making up our own plans. Don't be jumping in little dinghies or anything like that. Let's just stay in the boat. And that's kind of a good reminder. If you are confident that you are in God's boat, even when the seas get rough, stay in the boat. All right? God's got this. He's going to get us there. Might not be pleasant, might hit some rocks along the way, but it's better to be in his boat than our own boat. All right, picking up in verse 33. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks, he said. Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your heads will perish. Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, broke off a piece, and ate it. Sounds familiar? Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. When morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. Then they lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed toward shore. There's so many like nautical terms in all this. I know some of the people in here are like, they know exactly what's going on. I'm not really tracking what a foresail is, but okay. But they hit a shoal, and they ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship struck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape, but the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them try to carry out their plan. Then he ordered them all who could swim to jump overboard and make for land. The others held on to planks and debris from the broken ship, so everyone escaped safely to shore. So we go back, we see that Paul is breaking bread with these people. This wasn't a Eucharist, a communion, which we're going to take here in a little bit. They had no wine or anything like that, but I think in a way, Paul is walking them through a similar process of thanking God for all he's done for them, right? So they take this time, they thank God, they eat, they finally embrace or at least accept the idea that their fate is being tied to God's plan for Paul. And then we see the next morning they abandon their own desires. It doesn't say that, it's implied, but think about it. What was their goal? Paul's goal was to get to Rome. Their goal was to get the grain to Rome. And in the morning they woke up and they said, listen, we got to give up on what we want. We got to toss this grain overboard. They toss the grain overboard, and then what happens? They immediately find land. And I think that that's a really great example of what happens when you can abandon your own wants and your own desires. God's going to get you to where He wants you to go. I do want to jump into 28 just a little bit. We're going to do 10 more verses real quick. Once we were safe on shore, we learned that we were on the island of Malta. The people of the island were very kind to us, still philanthropos, by the way, generous to us. It was so cold and rainy, so they built us a fire on the shore to welcome us. As Paul gathered an armful of sticks and was laying them on the fire, a poisonous snake, driven out by the heat, bit him on the hand. The people of the island saw it hanging from his hand and said to each other, "A murderer, no doubt. Though he escaped the sea, justice will not permit him to live." But Paul, he shook the snake off into the fire and was unharmed. The people waited for him to swell up or suddenly drop dead, but when they had waited a long time and saw that he was unharmed, they changed their minds and decided he was a god. Near the shore where we landed was an estate belonging to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us and treated us kindly for 3 days. As it happened, Publius's father was ill with fever and dysentery. Paul went in and prayed for him, laying his hands on him, and healed him. As a result, then all other people on the island came and were healed as well. As a result, we were showered with honors, and when the time came to sail, people supplied us with everything we needed for the trip. I wanted to read this part because I think it carries on the same message about common grace that I was trying to make the point of, this indirect attack. First we see that Paul gets bitten by this snake. They see it as some sort of karma. What I think it really shows is that if you are on mission for God, He's going to get you to where you need to go. If it's His plan, He's going to make sure that it gets accomplished. So even though Paul was dealing with some evil men, heavy storms, shipwrecks, even a snake, the devil started making it really on the nose towards the end there with the snake. But even a poisonous snake couldn't stop Paul from getting to Rome. So God's going to get you there. If you're on God's boat, He's going to get the boat there. But I want to look at some of the indirect effects again. Because Paul was on this boat, the sailors and the prisoners received God's grace and safety. Because Paul ended up on this island, Publius's father and all the sick people on the island were also healed. All of these people experienced some form of God's grace because Paul was doing what God had laid out for him. Just because Paul was willing to do the work that God had for him, all of these people were indirectly feeling some of God's grace. So if you're struggling with committing your life to God's will, to finding out what it is in the kingdom He has for you to do, I want you guys to remember that it's not just about you, okay? If you aren't leaning into your calling, who might not be feeling God's grace in your life? Your coworkers, friends, family, are they missing out on some of God's grace because you haven't been willing to commit to the same level that Paul has? Is there a metaphorical island of people waiting to be healed because you commit to doing the work that God has for you? And that's what I want to focus on as we get ready to enter a time of communion. That's what I really want us to think about. What is our Rome? What is our mission? What is our purpose? What does God have laid out for us? Worship team, you guys can start coming up. Now, I know some of you know what God's calling is for you, and some of you are already living it out, okay? But some of you are not. Some of you are scared. You're waiting for God to give you some sort of a sign, or maybe you just don't want to. But I think it's time for us to start thinking about not just how doing God's work affects us directly, but who it affects indirectly. If you don't know what your calling or your purpose is, I would love to sit down and talk to you about it, but I'm going to tell you something that might be uncomfortable for a lot of people to hear. You're probably not going to find out that purpose by showing up here on Sundays and listening to me talk for 30 minutes. If you really want to find what God's purpose is for your life, you need to be in prayer, you need to be in the scriptures yourself, you need to be in your closet or in your bedroom on your knees in worship. It's a deeply personal thing. So if you want to find that, what God's purpose is in your life, you need to go home, you need to read, you need to pray, you need to ask Him. And when you get that answer, then I want you to come back and talk to me. Okay, I'd love to talk to you about it, find out how we can help you accomplish the calling that God has put on your life. I'm going to do kind of a hard transition into communion now, but we're going to enter a time of communion. Paul tells us that we should each examine our hearts before partaking in communion so that we do not drink judgment onto ourselves. So as believers, if you're a believer, we're going to take this time to examine our hearts, prepare to partake in the Lord's Supper. If you're not a believer, I would ask you not to partake, but instead examine your heart to maybe why you've decided not to be a believer yet, and I'd love to talk to you about that. For those that are partaking, these are the things that I want us to ask ourselves. What work has God given me to do? Am I completing that work? And if I'm not completing that work, what is preventing me from completing that work? And then if you do know what that is, ask Him to help you set those things aside so that we can fulfill the purpose that God has for us. The worship team is going to play for a little bit. So take some time, ask yourself those questions. When you feel ready, collect the elements for communion, then I'll come up and we will take communion together.